Now I'll add the mushing entity, which is going to inherit from the team entity. So just like adding a regular entity, I'll right-click, select Add New and Entity, and I'll name this new entity Mushing. Previously, I've left the base type to none, but this time I want to use the base type of team, and that's what sets up that inheritance relationship. Notice that as soon as I do that, all of the other properties in the dialog box are disabled. That's because this new entity is going to inherit those settings from the team object. And I'll click OK to create that. And notice that we have this relationship that is one of inheritance. So mushing inherits from team. Now I'm going to add properties to this object, just like I did for the other entities. But one little difference here is that I have properties selected, but I can't hit the Enter key in order to enter a new property. So what I need to do is right-click on this, select Add New, and select Scalar Property. And that adds the first one. So I'm going to name this one Leader1. And come back over here to Properties. I'll pin this back open again. And this is a string, and the max length is going to be 20. Come back over here, hit Enter, and Leader2. Notice that I can hit Enter now that I have a property, a first property within the entity. And I'll set the max length to 20 here as well. Okay, so again, this is where normalization breaks down in this example a little bit, but it works for the simple example. All right, so we have an object that inherits from team. Now I'm going to enter another object that also inherits from team. So I'm going to add new entity, and this one I'm going to call ski joring. The base type here I'll set to team as well, and click on OK, and now we have the ski joring object that inherits from team. I'll add a few properties. So I need spaces for the 3 dogs name. And by the way, 3 is a legitimate limit because there are no ski joring races that I know of that allow more than 3 dogs. So dog 1 name here will also be 20 characters. Dog 2, max length of 20. And oops, dog 3. Also max length of 20. All right, then I need to add one more property here, which is number of leaders. I'll widen this a little bit so we can see that full name. Whoops. Select that property. And in this case, it's going to be int32. So essentially, by including spaces for the 3 different dog names, as well as the number of leaders, that's going to give us some basic information about the configuration of the team as well, which is nice to explore and see what different teams are using. So there could be 1 leader, or there could be 2 leaders, or conceivably 3 leaders if you're using a fan hitch. That often isn't allowed in ski joring races, but a lot of people do that when they're just going out on the trails. All right, so there are inherited objects. And so the overall structure of the model is now in place. Now I need to add the associations between the event, race, and team entities. And then the inherited entities down here will participate in whatever associations the team has. So I don't need to do anything explicitly with these objects here. So I'm going to start by creating the one-to-many relationship between the event and race entities. So I'll right-click on the event entity there, and I'm going to select Add New Association. So a nice little benefit of right-clicking on the object is that it already has that object selected, rather than dragging an association from the toolbox and then having to wire up the whole thing. So I'm going to leave the default association name. Sometimes it is necessary to reference that name in code, so make sure it's something meaningful. But the concatenation of the names of the two entities that are being associated is going to work in most situations. All right, so event is selected as one end of it, and it has a multiplicity of 1, but I can change that to any of the multiplicities. And here, it guessed that I wanted to make a relationship with race and that its multiplicity was many, but I can change those items as well. I'm going to leave the default settings for the navigation properties because I do in fact want navigation properties. On event, I need races so I can get a reference to the collection of races associated with this event. Similarly, I want an event navigation property so that if I have a reference to a particular race, I can get information about the event that this race is associated with. All right, and then now down here there's some text that describes, essentially puts into English what these settings are doing. And so this is helpful to read and make sure that you have the right settings. Event can have many instances of race. That sounds right. Use event.races to access the race instances. And a race can have one instance of an event. Okay, all that sounds right, so I'll click on OK. And there's our association, and you can see that it's a one-to-many. All right, I'm going to do the same thing and add a new association between race and team. Race is one, team is many, because I have many teams in a single race. And I want navigation properties, and a race can have many instances of team, and team can have one instance of race. All that sounds right, and so now we have our other association. Now I can use those same steps to create a many-to-many relationship, and if I do that, when I create the database, the designer will create a join table in the database in order to manage that relationship. All right, so that's the model as far as I'm going to take it, but you can certainly go further and refine the model to your heart's content, making it as useful as possible for your application and storing its data. But now I'm going to get on with creating the database. One thing about this process, though, is that the database with an empty schema has to already exist. So I'm going to do that first. I'm going to use the Server Explorer window here, and I'm going to create a new data connection. Notice that I have one to the AdventureWorks LT 2012 database, but that's not going to work for me here. So I'm going to right-click on Data Connections, create a new SQL Server database, and I need to specify the server. So I'm going to do this on the local machine. Localhost will work as well. And I'm going to use Windows Authentication. Works just fine there. And set the database name to sled dog event. And I'll click on OK. Server version. Only servers up to. Well, that's kind of interesting. I'm using Visual Studio 2013, but only servers, and I'm using the latest SQL Server data tools, but apparently it doesn't support SQL Server 2014. Okay, fine. I won't do it that way. What I'll do is come down here into Management Studio, and I'll connect to a local instance of SQL Server and create the database here. Okay. All right, so now we have the database. All right, so I'll go back over here, and now I need to create a data connection to that database. Use Windows Authentication, and I'll use sled dog event. Test the connection, works fine, and click on OK. So there's something about the Create Database option there that in Visual Studio 2013 and the latest version of SQL Server Data Tools, which was released well after SQL Server 2014, doesn't work with that. But I can connect to that database. All right, so I've configured that. So now I just right-click here, and there's this option called Generate Database from Model. So I'll select that, and then select the sled dog event. And there you can see it builds the connection string to that database. So this is a part where you can see that the database already has to exist. All right, I'm going to save the connection settings in app.config and click on Next. And then it goes and generates the DDL, the Data Definition Language SQL script that will go out and create this database. Now if you want to, you can change the name of this script file. This is going to be added to the project, but I'm just going to leave that as it is. It's nice to leave it as it is because this associates, if you have multiple entity data models within a single project, you can very quickly link which script is associated with each model. All right, so you can see that the script is displayed here in this dialog box, and you can scroll through it. But it's actually much easier to look at the code within Visual Studio, within the designers, because there's no color coding in this window or anything like that. So I'm just going to click on Finish, and keep in mind that that is not going to execute the script, but instead it's going to generate the file and open it up within this Transact SQL designer. And as you can see, we have color coding, IntelliSense if we want to change the code, and so forth. All right, now there's a number of things to notice about this code. As you can see, this is the Entity Designer DDL script for SQL Server 2005, 8, 12, and Azure. So I'm going to be using it with SQL Server 2014. Should work, but we'll see. It's just because apparently this version of Entity Framework hasn't been updated to indicate 2014 works. The code here has a use statement of sled dog event, no create database statement, and there's no option to do that. So that's why the database had to already exist. All right, there's some sections up here for dropping foreign key constraints, as well as any existing tables. Because the sled dog event database is currently empty of all objects, there's no code here. But if you use the Entity Data Model Designer Wizard to update an existing database, which you can do, there will be appropriate code here in order to drop these objects. Keep in mind, you'll lose existing data if you do that. That's the one downside. Pretty big downside, though. All right, then scrolling down, here's the section where it creates the different tables. The table names are the names of the entity data set. So this is events, races, and teams instead of event, race, team. So they're all plural. If I scroll down a little further, we have the entities that inherit from teams, and notice the kind of funky name there, teams mushing and teams ski joring. And just is concatenating the base table name with the inherited table name. And then notice that there's nothing within these tables that indicate that their corresponding entities are involved in an inheritance relationship other than this foreign key relationship here, team ID in both of them. Also, if I come back up to the base tables, notice that the entity keys are set to an identity of 1, 1. So it's going to start at 1 and increment by 1 with each new row that you add to the table. All right, notice too the data types that are used for the various fields. Most of the strings are in varchar of a particular length. And that's when you set the max length property. So if we come down here, I set first name to 20, last name to 30. Actually, a better example here is city, where I set it just to a max length of 50. But here, first name and last name, I set the use fixed length to true, and so those are n chars instead of n varchars. So that's what happens, the difference when you set that, when you use that property. And then coming back up here to events, or actually to races, yeah, right here, races, have the distance property, which is set to a decimal of 18.0, which is the default precision and scale. I didn't change them, so it uses the default. Okay, the other thing is that, remember that I set a default value for the location field of Musher's Hall. But that's not defined there. If I go down, scroll a little further, this is the part that sets up the constraints. And as you can see, it sets the primary key and then the foreign key relationships here. But nothing about setting that default value. This is because the Generate Database Wizard doesn't use default values you set to define the database table. Instead, the generated event class, that entity data object that you use within your application, is going to manage the default value. All right, I'm going to come over here to Solution Explorer and open up this app.config. And as you can see, because I left the default value for that property within the wizard to create the connection string within app.config, it created this SD model container with the connection string to that location. So this consists of the metadata that Entity Framework needs at runtime, as well as, if I scroll a little further to the right, the ADO.NET connection string itself. Okay, so the last step that we need to do here is actually run this code and generate these database objects. So I'm going to right-click here and select the Execute option. It'll prompt for location, and I'll connect to it, and it'll go out. Commands were completed successfully. Now if I go back over to Management Studio and refresh this object, we can drill down in here and see that we have all of those tables, and we have all the objects, associations, referential integrity, and everything we need from that model. From here, you can continue to improve on the model and update the database until you have a model that works for your application. And you can do anything with this model that you can do with one created using database first design. All right, I'm going to go back over to my model now, because I want to talk about exploring the model with the model browser. This is another feature that is included with SQL Server data tools that help you work with Entity Framework. Or strictly speaking, this is part of Visual Studio. All right, so even though the AdventureWorks LT database doesn't have a huge number of tables and views, on most monitors you won't be able to view the entire model in the designer at one time. If you have a model with dozens or hundreds of entities or more, it can be downright impossible to find what you want. For models of any size, it can be hard to understand the structure of the conceptual model. And although you can use the Mapping Details window to explore and modify model mappings, the design surface doesn't have any way to explore the storage model. So I'm going to open up another instance of Visual Studio and go back to the AWLT project. Okay, hide that. So here's the model that I generated from the AdventureWorks LT 2012 database. Again, not a complex database, but so much that at least at this screen resolution, it's hard to see all of the different parts of the model all at once, and to easily get access to all of the properties and various objects. So instead, in order to use the designer like that, you can use the designer's model browser window. So a couple of different ways to open up this window is I can right-click on the design surface and select the model browser, or I can come up here into View, Other Windows, and find the model browser. And it's right there. Okay, so that's a little unwieldy, so I usually just come and right-click here and open up Model Browser. So what this browser view does is it provides a hierarchical overview of both the conceptual and the storage models. So if you explore the model browser, you can see that there's diagrams. This relates to the designer window, and you can use this to navigate to different objects. And then here's where you can explore the entity data model for this object. Get reference to all the entity types. There you can see all those, obviously in a much more complex entity data model for a more complex database. That list is going to be much longer. But the alphabetized, I can right-click on things. I can show in the diagram. So if this is embedded within 1,000 entities in the designer window, I can go directly to it. Just click on that right there, and it brings it front and center. And there's various other objects. All right, right-click there. I can add new objects. I can delete from the model, rename, validate. I can update the model from the database. So these are some of the model scope of commands, and perform various other functions. Okay, so this is the entity data model. And there's various other types. I can explore the associations. So those are all the associations, in this case, that were reverse engineered from the AdventureWorks LT 2012 database. All right, or if I want to explore the storage model, which is the details of how all of these tables are defined within the underlying database, I can come down here to awltmodel.store and access that information. And I can look at properties of those and see that, for example, this modified date is a date time and some of the other properties, particularly the facets.